I heard the words before I saw the papers. "I want a divorce, and I'm taking everything." The room was silent afterward, but inside me, the world had already tilted. He sat across from me, calm, almost polite, as if this were a business meeting, not the end of a life we'd built together. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent. My hands rested on the table, still, pretending I didn't notice the smirk tugging at his mouth, the way he thought I hadn't seen the phone light up with messages I wasn't supposed to see. They all thought I was fragile, gullible, too quiet to fight. They were wrong. But I didn't speak. Not yet. The mornings were always quiet. I would wake before anyone else, the soft hum of the city outside my window blending with the faint mechanical whir of the coffee machine in the kitchen. He was still asleep when I poured the first cup, leaving it on the counter just the way he liked it, no sugar, 1 cream. I moved carefully, quietly, as if the house itself required discretion. My routine had been honed over years, a quiet presence, almost invisible, attentive to every small need, every small expectation. I trusted that he noticed, even if he never said it. I believed that trust was enough. Our apartment reflected us, or at least the version of us we wanted to show the world. Books lined the living room shelves, organized by color and size, a careful symmetry that suggested order. There were framed photographs of trips, but only the ones we had taken together, smiling on sunlit streets or in hotel lobbies, moments captured and sanitized. Behind closed doors, there were routines, small rituals that no one else would see. The way he left his keys on the counter in the morning, the way I refilled his water glass without comment, the silent acknowledgement that each gesture was part of the quiet machinery of our life. I was careful not to intrude, but I watched. I watched the way he frowned at the morning news, the way he tapped his fingers when reading emails. I observed patterns, the small inconsistencies in tone or timing. I believed it was care, attention, trust. I thought our life was straightforward, predictable, safe. We spoke in the evenings about work, about trivialities, sometimes about dreams we would never pursue. He never raised his voice, and I never needed to. There was a balance, an unspoken rhythm that neither of us questioned. I had learned early to speak softly, to let my observations live quietly inside me, to keep them stored, cataloged, weighed. I was told I was patient, steady. People admired that. I considered it simply survival. Friends visited sometimes, always noticing how calm I seemed, how composed I could be even when the conversation faltered. I listened more than I spoke. My words were measured, deliberate, precise. I believed they carried weight because they were chosen, not because they were loud. There was power in restraint, though no one ever named it. I had been underestimated my whole life. People assumed silence meant weakness. They assumed attentiveness meant compliance. I had learned to let them assume. It was easier that way. Trust, I thought, was more enduring than confrontation. It was invisible, subtle, and I wore it like a second skin. Evenings often ended the same way. I would fold the laundry, stack the dishes, arrange the living room cushions just so. He would read in the armchair, half focused on a book, half watching me move through the apartment. I imagined he felt safe because of it, though he never said it. I imagined that trust, once built, was unshakable. I believed it. On weekends, we walked through the neighborhood, greeted the same neighbors who never looked beyond the surface, shopped at the same markets, always selecting what was familiar. I observed his interactions, the way he was polite but brief, the way he laughed easily when others spoke. But I noticed the subtle moments he didn't notice I noticed. A hesitation before answering a question, a glance that lingered too long on someone else. Small things, almost imperceptible, easily dismissed. I dismissed them too. I never questioned it. I had no reason to. Trust was mutual, I believed. My silence, my attentiveness, my careful cataloging of our life, these were marks of care, of devotion. I measured loyalty not in words, but in patterns, in consistency. Every day, the routine reinforced itself. Coffee, work, dinner, a quiet night, sleep. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. And yet, somewhere beneath it all, I stored the tiny unease, the faint trace of observation that whispered there might be cracks. I ignored it or convinced myself that trust made those cracks irrelevant. The world outside our apartment moved in chaos and light, but inside, I believed in the structure, in the patterns, in the quiet endurance of our life together. I believed in the safety of routine. I believed in him. It started with small things. Nothing I could point to directly, nothing that screamed danger. A message left open on his phone, the faint hesitation in his smile when I asked a simple question, the way his eyes would dart to the hallway as if someone else were just out of sight. I noticed, but I didn't speak. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, trust was our foundation, wasn't it? I reminded myself often, silence was not weakness, observation was not accusation. The first Sunday, he said he had a late meeting that didn't exist. I had checked the calendar, the office emails. There was no meeting, no appointment, no reason. He laughed lightly when I mentioned it later, a brief shrug, as if the subject was meaningless. I smiled in return, the corners of my lips tight, concealing the prickling doubt that had begun to settle in my chest. I catalogued it silently, alongside other small inconsistencies I hadn't acknowledged yet. The next week, I noticed that receipts from lunches or dinners didn't match the stories he told. He described meetings with colleagues, coffee with old friends, but the transactions told another story. It wasn't enough to confront him, yet. I told myself I was too sensitive, that the mind finds patterns where none exist. Still, I kept a mental record, quiet but precise, because that was my nature, to see and remember, even when it hurt to notice. At home, the subtle tension grew. He would enter the apartment, casual as always, and yet something was different. The air would feel heavier, and the weight of unspoken truths pressed against the walls. I would pour a glass of water, adjust the cushions, fold a shirt, doing what I had always done, and all the while watching him, listening to the background noise of his life that didn't belong to me. He didn't notice, or he pretended not to. Friends began to ask questions too. "Is everything all right?" one would say, noticing a shadow behind my smile, a hesitation in my voice. I would nod, assuring them that yes, everything was normal because it was, externally. Inside, though, a quiet unease began to burrow into my routine. I could feel my trust straining, stretching thinner with each anomaly, each evasive glance, each story that didn't line up. Yet I remained calm because giving voice to suspicion felt dangerous. I had learned early that restraint was safety. Evenings carried their own tension. I would serve dinner, noticing the way he avoided my gaze while scrolling on his phone, or the way his laugh sometimes came too late, as if he were reacting to someone else's words in a conversation I was excluded from. The home we had built together felt increasingly hollow, the silence between us growing heavier with every unanswered question. One night, I overheard a voice on the phone, quick, clipped, unfamiliar. He ended the call before I could identify it, his expression neutral, almost detached. My stomach knotted, but I said nothing. I washed the dishes, stacked the knives, wiped the counters. The ritual steadied me. I catalogued the anomaly, a new addition to the growing mental ledger of doubt. Even in the smallest moments, the sense of being watched or excluded crept in. Invitations that never came, messages that seemed deliberately hidden, plans that changed without explanation. Nothing concrete, nothing I could confront. And yet the quiet unease persisted, a whisper beneath the hum of normalcy. I could feel the shift, subtle but real, like a tremor before an earthquake. I began to question my own perception. Was I imagining these inconsistencies? Was my attentiveness a flaw, making me see shadows where there were none? I cataloged the doubts, too, alongside the facts, alongside the minor anomalies, because restraint required patience. Patience required observation, and observation required silence. It was a tension I carried alone. No one saw it because I made sure of it. My face remained calm, my movements precise, my voice even. The trust I had once worn like armor now felt fragile, like thin glass under a heavy hand. And yet I did nothing, because the unease was only a whisper, and I was trained to wait for clarity, to let truth reveal itself in time. By the end of the week, the unease had woven into the fabric of my days. Coffee, work, dinner, folded laundry, all performed with meticulous attention, all observed with quiet calculation. Normality persisted on the surface, but underneath, a seed had taken root. The realization that not everything I believed, not everything I trusted, was certain. I reminded myself again: patience, observation, restraint. Trust, carefully catalogued, could survive even the smallest crack. I was careful not to let the whisper become a voice, not yet. It was no longer a whisper. The small anomalies I had once dismissed now carried weight. Patterns emerged, subtle but undeniable, and they no longer fit the life I thought we shared. One evening, I found a credit card statement tucked behind a folder, a routine filing I had performed hundreds of times before. The transactions didn't align with his explanations. Lunches with colleagues turned into expensive dinners at places I had never heard of. Small sums, nothing dramatic, yet significant enough to pierce the illusion of transparency. I folded the paper and slipped it into my bag, my hands steady but my pulse quickening. Observation demanded restraint, not confrontation. He came home later than usual that night, feigning tiredness. I offered the coffee I had set aside, as always. He accepted, murmuring thanks, and sat in the same armchair he always did. His gaze fell elsewhere, not meeting mine, and for a fraction of a second I caught the exact shape of his avoidance. The slight tilt of his head, the tension in his shoulders, the quick exhale before he smiled. I catalogued it. Over the next few days, inconsistencies multiplied. He spoke of meetings that never existed, of colleagues I had never met. The tone of his voice, casual but careful, betrayed an awareness that he was being monitored, even if only by me. I noted the subtle rehearsals, the slight overcorrections, and stored them away, like evidence in a file only I could access. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was stress, perhaps minor mistakes. But the unease in my chest grew heavier. I noticed the little things most would ignore: a phone left on silent, messages disappearing, the brief pause before answering a question. I began checking details quietly, silently, letting the evidence accumulate while maintaining the facade of normalcy. He was unaware, or so he believed. The first truly alarming moment came when I discovered a message, not meant for me, yet displayed briefly on his laptop screen. A name I did not recognize, a meeting I had not been told about. My instinct told me to confront him, but I didn't. Silence was my instrument, observation my weapon. I allowed myself only a quiet tightening of the jaw, a note in my ledger of anomalies, and continued folding laundry, as if nothing had happened. Even in public, I noticed the changes. A laugh too quick, a glance too deliberate, a story retold with slight differences. Friends who once admired my calm composure began to ask questions about his behavior, questions I answered with practiced neutrality. I did not panic. I did not accuse. I only watched. Patterns, after all, reveal themselves in time. I also noticed my own reactions, the way my stomach tightened when he returned home late, the way my hands would linger over the phone or the laptop when he stepped away. I cataloged my own unease, reminding myself that restraint was essential. Any confrontation now could destroy clarity. I could not afford to act before I understood the full picture. A subtle moment, almost imperceptible, struck me hardest. I caught him in the act of deleting a message from his phone. Not carelessness, not accident. Purposeful, deliberate. He did not notice me standing there, but I noticed him. The calm I maintained was external only. Internally, a storm gathered, quiet but intense. I understood in that moment that the trust I had placed so completely in him was fractured. The fracture was not loud. It was invisible, insidious, and entirely real. At night, when the apartment was silent, I reviewed my mental ledger. Dates, times, discrepancies, glances, deleted messages. Each small act catalogued with precision. I did not speak, I did not accuse, but the balance had shifted. The reality I had believed in, the life of quiet trust and shared routine, was no longer whole. I began to understand, finally, that being underestimated had its advantages. He thought my silence meant compliance, my observation meant harmless attentiveness. He could not see the weight of my attention, the depth of my quiet tracking. He could not see that restraint was a kind of power, and that patience allowed truth to surface, slowly but inevitably. Even as I moved through the motions of normal life, work, dinner, small talk, an invisible tension had been threaded through every action. I was no longer entirely present in the life we shared. I was watching, cataloging, learning. I had stepped into the role I had always occupied without notice, the observer of reality, quietly preparing for its unveiling. By the end of that week, the first real red flags had solidified into undeniable patterns. I could no longer dismiss the inconsistencies. He had created a parallel life, carefully hidden, and the evidence, however subtle, was now within my reach. I remained silent. I always remained silent. The confrontation I had avoided came to me anyway, but not in the form I expected. It arrived slowly, in comments and glances, in the quiet undermining of my perception. It was subtle at first. A question I asked about his schedule met with an exaggerated sigh, a glance that suggested I was foolish for asking. "You're overthinking again," he said one evening, voice calm, almost patronizing. His tone implied that the suspicions I had catalogued, the questions I had silently nurtured, were the problem, not his actions. I tried to maintain composure. I listened to him speak, measured my own breathing, and observed. My hand rested on the table, unmoving, though my mind catalogued the slight tension in his jaw, the deliberate precision of his words. He was attempting to rewrite the story, to make me doubt the evidence I had accumulated. I had suspected gaslighting was possible. I had never imagined it would feel so precise, so methodical. It became a pattern. A phone call I noticed, the brief flicker of a name, was dismissed later as work nonsense. A receipt I found in the mail was explained away as a mistake. Each denial carried a subtle weight, a suggestion that I was confused, paranoid, or overly attentive. "You always read too much into things," he said once after I noticed another discrepancy. His words were soft, calm, almost caring. And yet the message was clear: I was the problem. Friends began to notice as well. When I recounted small inconsistencies, the odd timing, the unexplained errands, they hesitated. I could feel their discomfort, their doubt seeded by his calm reassurances. I realized then how carefully he controlled perception, not with force or anger, but with quiet manipulation, the kind that eroded confidence slowly, leaving the other person questioning their own judgment. Even in our home, the dynamic shifted. He would leave messages on the kitchen counter, ones that seemed innocuous but were deliberately misleading. He suggested I had forgotten appointments, misread texts, or misremembered conversations. Each dismissal chipped away at my certainty, testing the boundaries of my silence. I kept cataloging, as always, refusing to react outwardly. I had learned that restraint preserved clarity, even when it felt like erosion. At work, I began to notice the ripple effect. He would casually mention things to colleagues that made me appear absent-minded, distracted, or forgetful. Comments framed as jokes, small insinuations, quietly shifting the narrative so that even witnesses began to question my reliability. I could feel the tension building, a low-grade pressure that made each interaction outside the apartment slightly more delicate. One evening, after a dinner that had been perfectly ordinary, he made a casual remark about my memory, about my inability to keep track of things. The words were mild, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to me they landed like stones against glass. I said nothing. I served the coffee, smoothed the napkins, and moved silently through the kitchen. Inside, a quiet anger stirred, but outwardly I remained composed. The ledger grew. Every lie, every dismissal, every subtle manipulation was noted. I realized he had mastered control not through confrontation, but through the invisible architecture of doubt. He could erode trust without raising his voice, without anger, without exposing intent. And I could do nothing to prove it, not yet. Any reaction would be used against me, another mark in the slowly growing narrative that painted me as irrational, emotional, overreactive. The gaslighting extended into trivialities as well. He would misplace objects and suggest that I had moved them, rewrite casual conversations, or insist that I had agreed to something I never had. Each small act was calculated, designed to destabilize me, to make me question the accuracy of my own perception. The cumulative effect was exhausting. My internal ledger had become both shield and anchor, a record I could trust even as my environment threatened to make me doubt it. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet, I reviewed everything. The discrepancies, the lies, the dismissals. The patterns were clear. He was erasing truth from perception, replacing it with a narrative in which I appeared unreliable, overly sensitive, incapable of judgment. I cataloged each act carefully, noting date, time, and context, building a quiet archive of truth. And still I did not speak. I did not react. I simply observed, restrained my emotion, and waited. I had learned that the cost of exposure too soon could be catastrophic. Patience, careful observation, and silence were my only tools. The balance of power had shifted. He believed he controlled it. But in truth, every subtle lie, every dismissal, every act of gaslighting had been noted. In the quiet, I allowed myself a single acknowledgement. I was not wrong. I was not imagining it. The world around me might doubt me, he might dismiss me, but I had proof in the ledger of my own mind. And that proof would guide what came next. It began with an email I wasn't meant to see. I had been going through old files on the shared laptop, reorganizing documents in the way I always did, careful, methodical, quiet. The subject line caught my attention immediately. It wasn't addressed to me, yet it contained details I had suspected for weeks. Names, dates, appointments, evidence of meetings and arrangements he had denied. I froze, letting the words sink in. There was no ambiguity. The truth had begun to leak quietly and yet with undeniable clarity. I read it again, slowly this time, absorbing every detail. The way he had tried to compartmentalize, the meticulous planning to keep his parallel life hidden. Every lie I had catalogued now aligned with evidence. Patterns that I had noticed, dismissed, rationalized, now revealed themselves as deliberate acts of deception. I did not speak. I did not react. I simply noted, silently, the weight of what I had discovered. Over the next few days, the partial exposure expanded. I observed him more carefully, tracking movements, messages, small discrepancies. I began to see him through the lens of what I now knew. The careful manipulations, the rehearsed explanations, the invisible threads he had pulled to maintain his facade. He was no longer just deceptive. He was systematic, operating within a network of hidden truths and careful lies. A colleague unexpectedly became a witness. She mentioned in passing a dinner she had attended with him, something he had never told me about. Her casual reference confirmed part of the ledger I had been maintaining for weeks. The validation was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but powerful. The reality I had suspected was no longer hidden. Pieces of the puzzle aligned in ways that were undeniable. I also found small records, receipts, bookings, messages that contradicted his denials. Each piece added weight to the truth, quietly confirming the suspicions I had restrained myself from voicing. I realized he had underestimated my patience, my attentiveness, and my capacity to gather evidence without confrontation. He assumed silence was weakness. He could not see that it was, in fact, preparation. Even in our home, the cracks became more visible. He entered with the same calm demeanor, but I noticed the slight hesitation when he realized I had seen or heard more than he intended. His actions were measured, deliberate, yet tinged with the faintest trace of apprehension. It was almost imperceptible, a shadow beneath the practiced ease he projected. I catalogued it, the smallest sign of internal pressure that contradicted his outward composure. One evening, I quietly accessed his calendar. Events he had previously claimed were canceled had, in fact, taken place. Meetings, lunches, trips, each a thread in the web he had spun. I did not confront him, but I documented everything. My notes were precise, chronological, and devoid of emotion. Every act of deceit was recorded alongside my observations of behavior, gestures, and tones. The ledger had become a living record of truth. I noticed the psychological strain on him, though he did not admit it. The careful choreography of lies requires constant vigilance, and small cracks began to appear. A delayed reply, a hesitated answer, a glance that lingered too long on something I had already observed. Witnesses outside our household, even casual ones, began to intersect with the evidence I had compiled. His control was subtly eroding, though he remained unaware of how much I had seen. The partial exposure was not a revelation I could broadcast. It was fragile, like a thin layer of ice that could shatter if disturbed too soon. I maintained normalcy, continuing routines as if nothing had changed. Coffee prepared each morning, the living room arranged with care, conversations conducted in the same measured tone. Yet beneath it all, the ledger grew, and with it, a quiet confidence that I was no longer imagining the betrayal, no longer vulnerable to manipulation. I began to understand the power of restraint in a new way. Evidence, witnesses, and systems, the combination of which I had quietly observed, were stronger than confrontation. Each new confirmation, each small slip he made, strengthened the inevitability of truth. It was no longer a matter of perception. The betrayal had a record, a structure, a framework that could not be denied without exposing even more. By the end of this phase, the scale had shifted. The partial exposure had revealed the reality I had long suspected. Trust had been broken, carefully and deliberately. The evidence was growing too substantial to ignore, and yet I remained silent. Patience had become both shield and strategy. I was no longer just observing deception. I was preparing for its natural consequences. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement. I was ready. Not for confrontation, not yet, but for the moment when the system of lies would meet the weight of undeniable truth. Until then, I remained composed, restrained, and deliberate. The ledger, witnesses, and subtle patterns had become my allies. The exposure had begun, and it would not be undone. The tension shifted from subtle to unmistakable. By now, the ledger in my mind had grown heavy with evidence, but I maintained my routine as if nothing had changed. Coffee poured, dishes stacked, clothes folded, everything performed with precision, quiet and careful. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the quiet battle unfolding inside our walls. Inside, though, the stakes had risen sharply. He sensed something was different, though he could not identify what, and the control he had once taken for granted began to falter. It started with small confrontations, indirect and calculated. He questioned my tone in casual conversations, critiqued my memory of events, subtly suggesting I was being dramatic or imagining slights. His words were calm, almost gentle, but the message was clear. He was testing boundaries, asserting dominance where he felt it slipping. I responded with silence, the only acknowledgement a steady gaze and deliberate calm. I catalogued each remark, each microaggression, each evasive answer as if filing it away for the inevitable reckoning. Evenings grew tense. He returned home later than he had ever done before, pretending exhaustion while carefully observing my reactions. I noted the careful choreography, the precise timing of his steps, the controlled inflection in his voice, the way he monitored my attention without acknowledging it. He believed I was unaware, but I had long learned to see beyond performance. The pattern of deceit was predictable to me now, the rehearsed lies as familiar as the lines in a book I had read 100 times. One night, I discovered additional evidence, text messages, receipts, and emails that he had assumed I could never access. They aligned with previous anomalies, confirming suspicions I had quietly stored for weeks. Each new piece strengthened the structure I had been building, a framework of truth invisible to him. He did not know the ledger existed, and it became clear he was unaware of how deeply I had been observing. His reactions began to escalate as well. The subtle control tactics shifted toward frustration. He became impatient with the minor inconsistencies in his narrative. He questioned neighbors, casual acquaintances, and colleagues in ways that suggested suspicion, a sign of internal pressure. I noticed his hesitations, the cracks in his previously seamless demeanor, and recorded them silently. Every micro-expression, every shift in posture, every pause was evidence of the psychological strain he could not mask. Conversations grew more calculated. I would speak only when necessary, choosing words with precision, allowing him to dominate the dialogue while ensuring that each statement he made was documented in my ledger of patterns. His attempts to manipulate, gaslight, and assert control became more apparent and more desperate. And yet, I did not confront him. I never confronted him. Patience, observation, and quiet restraint remained my shield. A witness unexpectedly surfaced in the form of an acquaintance from his office. She casually referenced an event, a meeting, a dinner, details he had denied or concealed. I made no acknowledgement. I did not react. But internally, the evidence solidified, forming a lattice of corroboration that no lie could now withstand. I stored every detail, every nuance, every slip, knowing that the accumulation of truth was stronger than any argument or confrontation. Even the household systems, Emails, calendars, messages betrayed him. I accessed them quietly, cataloging inconsistencies and misrepresentations. It became increasingly clear that his parallel life was no longer sustainable under scrutiny. Each document, each record, each corroborating witness was a strand in a web that only I could see in its entirety. He believed he was in control, but the foundation of that control had already begun to crumble under invisible weight. The escalation was also emotional. I noticed the subtle changes in his tone, the way he measured his laughter, the brief flashes of impatience when I asked innocuous questions. I cataloged each shift, each controlled pause, each carefully concealed irritation. These were signs of the internal consequences of deception, hints that his system of lies was beginning to fracture under the pressure of unseen observation. Even as the tension rose, I remained outwardly calm. The apartment retained its order. The routines were maintained. Conversations were conducted with measured civility. I never allowed him to see the ledger, the evidence, the quiet accumulation of truth that had grown into an unassailable structure. And yet, the balance of power had shifted. He could sense it in fragments, in moments too subtle to articulate. And that awareness made him reckless in small ways, exposing cracks he could not repair. By the end of the week, the escalation had reached a point where confrontation was imminent, though I did not provoke it. The ledger, witnesses, and systems had combined to form a lattice of undeniable truth. He reacted, not with overt aggression, but with careful testing, subtle control attempts, and hints of internal pressure that betrayed the reality I had already seen. And I waited. Always I waited. By the time the reality of his betrayal had fully crystallized, I no longer needed to chase evidence. It presented itself at every turn. Each inconsistency, each hidden message, each corroborating witness had formed a lattice of truth I could no longer ignore. The ledger I had meticulously maintained in my mind was no longer just notes. It was the quiet architecture of betrayal. And yet, I did not act with anger, nor did I confront him directly. The truth had weight, but so did restraint. It was one evening when the full scope hit me. I had been arranging the living room, folding the laundry, the familiar tasks that had long kept me steady, when a message from one of his colleagues appeared on the shared calendar. The contents were casual, almost banal, but they confirmed details I had long suspected. Another thread in the web of lies, and yet the clarity it brought was devastating. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the ache of realization, the slow burn of moral collapse. I sat in the armchair he had once occupied, careful not to disturb anything, and let the weight settle. The life I had trusted, the routines I had maintained, the home I had built quietly, were illusions. Every smile, every assurance, every whispered, "I love you," now carried the texture of deceit. And still, I did not speak. My silence had become my armor, but it was also a mirror, reflecting back the cost of observation and patience. There was a moment, brief and almost imperceptible, when he entered the room and glanced at me. For the first time, I sensed unease in him. Not fear, not guilt, just a flicker of awareness that something was amiss. His calm demeanor wavered for a fraction of a second before returning, perfectly rehearsed. I catalogued the change, noting how the weight of his deception was beginning to press upon him, subtly, invisibly. The breaking point was not dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no confrontations, no emotional explosions. Instead, it came as a realization of cost. I recognized the moral and emotional toll, the way trust could be shattered silently, the way betrayal could be so complete and deliberate that it left no room for dialogue. I felt the psychological cost of patience and observation, of restraint over action. Every day of silence had accumulated, every carefully noted detail now contributing to a moral clarity that was both painful and precise. I realized that responding with anger would have been a concession to him, a way of allowing him to control the narrative, to frame me as emotional, reactive, irrational. But I did not want that. The ledger had become my testimony, my quiet power, and the truth would surface through systems, witnesses, and consequences, not through theatrics or confrontation. Restraint had become a moral imperative. Even as I moved through the apartment, performing small, ordinary tasks, I felt the weight of inevitability. The papers, the messages, the evidence, all would eventually intersect. The structures he had built to conceal his actions were beginning to collapse under the pressure of quiet observation. The calm exterior he projected could not erase the subtle signs of strain I had catalogued. The reality of his deception was becoming unavoidable, though he remained unaware of how fully I understood it. I also recognized my own limits. Emotional restraint had its cost, a quiet exhaustion, a feeling of isolation even in shared spaces, and the continuous effort of maintaining composure while the truth simmered beneath the surface. But I also recognized the power in that restraint. I was no longer merely a participant in his deception. I was its silent witness, cataloger, and arbiter. Late that night, after he had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The quiet of the apartment was complete, yet heavy with accumulated truths. I reviewed the ledger again in my mind. Every meeting, every lie, every misdirection, every subtle manipulation catalogued precisely. I felt the moral and emotional cost in the slow burn of awareness, yet I also felt a steadying sense of control. The power no longer belonged to him. It resided quietly with me, measured, restrained, and deliberate. I understood then that my breaking point was not about confrontation or revenge or even recognition. It was about accepting the truth, internalizing the cost, and choosing the quiet path of calculated patience over emotional reaction. I was free of illusion, but I was burdened by clarity. The balance of power had shifted. He had underestimated me, and the realization of that quiet dominance was both a moral reckoning and a psychological turning point. I did not celebrate. I did not announce it. I simply accepted it. The truth had emerged in a slow, deliberate manner, and I had survived it with restraint intact. The ledger remained, the system of observation remained, and the inevitable consequences would follow. But I would meet them with quiet composure, having endured the moral and emotional breaking point without losing myself to anger or desperation. The truth, once partial and hidden, now began to assert itself in ways that could no longer be ignored. It unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly, but with weight undeniable. He still maintained his calm exterior, but the cracks I had catalogued for weeks were widening, faint yet visible to anyone who observed closely. Systems, witnesses, and records began converging in a way that exposed what had long been invisible. I did not intervene. I did not accelerate it. I allowed it to progress naturally, letting the consequences reach their own conclusion. It began with small acknowledgments from others. Colleagues, friends, and even casual acquaintances mentioned discrepancies he could no longer control. A dinner he had claimed to attend alone was referenced by someone I had never anticipated. A business meeting he had dismissed was corroborated by an email I had discovered earlier. Each confirmation reinforced the ledger in my mind, a quiet validation that the reality of betrayal could no longer be denied. At home, the tension grew taut. He moved with the same rehearsed precision, but I noticed hesitation in his steps, pauses in his speech that revealed internal reckoning he could not articulate. He tried to maintain the narrative he had constructed, but every new piece of corroboration made that narrative brittle. I observed, silently, cataloging every nuance of his behavior. The power had shifted. He believed he controlled the environment, but in truth, each act of concealment now worked against him. The legal paperwork arrived, unanticipated yet inevitable. Divorce filings, documents outlining property and financial arrangements, proofs he had thought I would never see in their complete context. I signed the papers quietly, as I had known I would, without protest, without negotiation. My signature was an acknowledgement not of defeat, but of understanding. The systems were now aligned with the truth, and his attempt to dominate reality had already failed silently. Witnesses provided subtle validation. Friends who had once hesitated to speak now offered careful confirmation of what they had noticed, small remarks that collectively exposed the breadth of his duplicity. There was no spectacle, no drama, only the quiet convergence of corroboration that made the truth unavoidable. I did not need to argue or present evidence. Each small acknowledgement reinforced what I had already known. The betrayal was no longer a question. It was a reality. Financial and practical consequences followed predictably. Arrangements he assumed were secure were quietly reallocated. Accounts, assets, responsibilities, all shifted according to the documentation I had maintained, the careful ledger I had silently built over months. He had assumed control through deceit, but the systems he had manipulated were now impartial, and impartiality does not bend to deception. I let it happen without interference. Each transfer, each recalibration was a quiet reminder that power does not always reside in force. It often resides in structure, procedure, and patience. Emotionally, the apartment felt different. The air, once heavy with unacknowledged tension, now carried the weight of inevitability. He moved through the spaces we had shared, aware of the subtle imbalance, the quiet collapse of his previously unchallenged authority. His calm was performative, fragile. Mine was deliberate, measured, and unshakable. I did not gloat. I did not assert triumph. I simply continued my routines with precision, letting the consequences speak for themselves. Evenings, once punctuated by subtle manipulations and gaslighting, became quiet markers of reality. He could no longer rely on deception, and I no longer relied on words. The ledger, the systems, the witnesses, all had done what confrontation could not. He faced consequences, not through drama or spectacle, but through the inevitability of evidence and structure. By the end of the week, the full impact of his actions had emerged in subtle yet undeniable ways. Trust he had assumed would remain had vanished. Attempts to manipulate further were futile. I had signed the documents, witnessed the confirmations, and allowed the systems to redistribute power silently, without interference. The consequences were total, yet unobtrusive, an invisible reckoning for the carefully constructed illusion he had relied upon. And still, I remained calm. I maintained my routines, my composure, and my silence. The truth was now undeniable, and yet it required no celebration. It existed quietly, in systems, witnesses, and records, a reminder that deception can never fully obscure reality. The consequences were real, heavy, and complete. The apartment was still. The air carried a weight I could feel but could not name, a residue of months spent observing, cataloging, and enduring. The papers were signed, the accounts reconciled, the subtle confirmations from witnesses had all been absorbed into the ledger I carried silently. The consequences had arrived, fully and without fanfare, and yet the apartment felt emptier than it had ever been. He moved through the space with care, perhaps aware of the imbalance that now existed, though powerless to correct it. I did not watch him. I did not need to. The record of his choices, the systems, and the witnesses had done what my observation alone could not. They had solidified the reality of his betrayal in ways he could not manipulate. The power that had seemed his now resided in quiet structures and meticulous records, things he had ignored because he assumed silence was weakness. I went about my evening routines, the dishes, the folded laundry, the quiet arrangement of the living room cushions. Each movement was deliberate, each action a marker of endurance. The routines that had once been invisible markers of normality now felt like small declarations of self-possession. I did not speak of the ledger, nor did I reveal the accumulation of evidence that had guided my restraint. The truth had already spoken for itself. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, I allowed myself a moment to feel the weight of clarity, the slow, deliberate recognition that trust had been shattered, but that I had survived it without surrendering my composure. There was no triumph, no victory, no spotlight. Only the quiet after the storm, heavy and resolute. I turned off the lights, leaving the apartment in darkness. The silence pressed against the walls like a quiet witness to all that had happened. I lay down, steady, aware, unshaken. The betrayal had been fully realized, the consequences quietly administered, and the ledger, silent, unassailable, remained with me. And in that quiet, I understood. Some battles are won not with confrontation or speech, but with observation, patience, and restraint. The aftermath was heavy, calm, and final.